thank you for joining us this morning in Montreal, Canada. I'm happy to introduce you our seasoned and upcoming researcher from the University of Montreal. So this session will showcase a wide range of research in cybercrime and cybersecurity done here at the University of Montreal. Our presentation will focus on illicit markets, sexual offenders, social media participation, and on the relation between the concept of cybercrime and cybersecurity. And on that note, I will pass the mic to our first presenter, Professor Benoit Dupont, and I hope you will enjoy our session. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Cecilia. And as we say here in Montreal, merci beaucoup. And before I start my presentation, I'd like to thank the whole team behind SECREV and Raphael, and in particular as well, Michael Joyce, who has been a driving force behind the organization of this international event. And he hasn't slept much over the past night, but he's been really making sure that this whole event is a success. From Oceania to Europe and now to North America. So my presentation, I'm going to share my screen. If you bear with me for a second. Thank you very much. So this presentation stems from a paper I recently published with my co-author and good friend, Chad Whelan at Deakin University. And the paper is about the relationships or the lack of relationships between criminology and cybersecurity, and why, in our opinion, we need to do a lot more to make sure that those two fields of research interact a lot more. And first, to look at the reasons and maybe the history and the legacy behind the lack of interactions. And in the second part of my presentations, the reasons why we should do a lot more and how practitioners are actually driving this need and this new reality. So cybersecurity and cyber criminology are both concerned with online harms and responses to those harms. So it would seem logical that they share many theoretical and many empirical approaches. But in practice, this is really not the case. And the two fields of research have really attacked the problems very differently. And that has resulted in two very discrete fields of research, mobilizing different conceptual frameworks, different research questions, different data sets, publication outlets, and career paths. And I think this is really a shame, and I think we need probably to remedy that. So the agenda of my presentation will first look at the origins of cybercriminology and cybersecurity as fields of research. I will then look at the relational dynamics of these two fields in terms of harms, and in particular, how those harms are intersecting more and more. Also in terms of responses, and for that we will be using the high policing, low policing framework that was designed here at the Université de Montréal by our late colleague Jean-Paul Bauder. And finally, maybe I'll conclude and end my presentation on some of the research questions where I think cybercriminology and cybersecurity could or maybe should converge in the very near future. So in terms of the evolution, the birth and the evolution of cybercriminology, the first recorded instances of illicit uses of computer systems occurred in the 1960s and were at the hands of insiders and were documented by Parker in his first book in 1976. The democratization of personal computers in the 1980s and the 1990s afforded a whole new range of criminal opportunities to young offenders who morphed into profit-driven cyber criminals in the 2000s as the internet become democratized and financial systems and users happen to shop more and more online. And finally, at the current moment, the digitalization of society provides a constant stream of new criminal opportunities, and cyber criminology as a field of research is expanding and growing very quickly to document and to try to provide a better understanding of what's happening in that space. For criminologists, one of the main and the first dilemmas was how to understand cyber offenses in the existing typologies of conventional crimes. Are cyber offenses a brand new form of offending, and should we succumb to the hyperbole of novelty, saying that everything is transforming and we need to rethink entirely crime and crime theories? Or, to borrow the analogy of my good friend Peter Grabowski in Australia, are cyber crimes merely old wine in new bottles, for which we have existing and perfectly adequate conventional theories and methods that we can just apply to this new digital environment? As a result, criminologists, in trying to answer that question, have designed typologies of cyber crimes to try to understand whether it's entirely new, whether it's something that's merely an extension of existing crimes, or something hybrid in between. And the most frequently used typology is one derived from the work of David Wall and Mike Maguire in the 2000s to 2013 time period, where they came up with a three-tiered typology where you have cyber-dependent crimes, which are crimes that wouldn't exist without the happening of new technologies, so hacking, distributed denial of service attacks, the emergence of malware. The second category of cyber crimes would be cyber-enabled crimes, so crimes where technology is amplifying existing forms of offending. And finally, cyber-assisted crimes, where technology is in use, but merely it's peripheral. So drug trafficking and terrorism, for example, where you have technology being used to scramble and encrypt communications, but technology is not used to amplify, to extend the reach of the offenders. So reflecting on those patterns is very useful, but it's also limited at a specific point in time. And this approach is challenged by a constant stream of changes and configurations introduced by new technologies. And in an environment where we are saturated by innovation and new digital technologies, my first question would be how long the concept of cybercrime will remain really useful for us as social scientists, and whether in 10 years' time we will just talk about crime, implying the digital component of crimes, because every single crime will have this digital cyber component baked into it. As a result of this thinking, these efforts to understand how we should conceptualize cybercrime, criminologists have had to adapt their measurement tools to try to accurately capture the prevalence and the incidence of cybercrime. And this ambiguity around the definition of cybercrime has made their work a little bit more difficult. And that has been made a little bit more complicated even by the fact that the prosecution of the majority of cybercrimes is done through tech-neutral statutes that pay a lot more attention to the substance of the offense than to the technological means to commit the crime. So the online and the offline components of a crime from a technology perspective are really hard to disentangle from a legal and a statistical perspective. And that's why it's really been hard for criminologists and official statisticians to capture cybercrime data. And that's why we have very, very fragmented data at the moment to work with. And that's also why criminologists and policymakers very often end up relying on very dubious data and statistics produced by cybersecurity firms and think tanks. However, the behavioral visibility of cyber offenders also means that criminologists have been able to rely on very interesting data to try to capture what's happening in the cybercrime underground. And hacking forums in particular have been very useful to understand the illicit markets that are driving cybercrime. Quite a few criminologists have also used youth surveys, victim surveys, interviews with victims, and to a lesser extent, interviews with malicious hackers. But we still have a lot more work to do in terms of collecting very useful data to understand cybercrime. The theoretical frameworks in criminology being used are very classical theories of crime. I've listed some of them here, and to a much lesser extent, the work from our science technology studies colleagues, such as actor network theory, or the work of our biology ecology colleagues whose theories of co-evolutionary adaptation, in my view, would be very, very useful to understand cybercrime. Again, not as an evolution, not as a revolution. And even to a lesser extent, evaluative approaches such as RCTs of law enforcement or private sector interventions seeking to prevent and disrupt cybercrime are extremely rare at the moment. And I think we need a lot more of those to build up our arsenal of knowledge tools to understand cybercrime. If we switch now to cybersecurity as a field of research, it also has experienced a shift in terminology from the 1960s, where it was known as computer security, to the 2010s, where the term of cybersecurity gained currency and really overtook information security, which was very popular in the 2000s. And this shift reflects the broadening interest of cybersecurity researchers from an exclusive interest in machines to a broader interest in information to finally now a more inclusive consideration of humans and the interactions of humans, machines, information, and the social institutions that organize all of those actors. A colleague of mine, Kathleen Carley, tried to measure, assess all the disciplines involved in cybersecurity, and she came up with 41 disciplines involved in the cybersecurity research, with 70 to 80% of publications coming from computer scientists and engineering researchers, mainly focused on hardware and software security, and a neat 20 to 30% of publications coming from social scientists, including political scientists, sociologists, legal scholars, and so on and so forth. So there is a growing use and a growing convergence of computer scientists and social scientists around theories of human-computer interactions, behavioral economics as well, to try to design more effective systems and interactions. From the work of computer scientists and policy researchers, the focus has been very much on national security, which tends to emphasize very catastrophic scenarios, and you've probably heard a lot of those cyber Pearl Harbor analogies or cyber Armageddon analogies, which I think are not very productive because it securitizes online harms and it normalizes emergency responses that may violate legal and social norms to those very catastrophic scenarios. And it fails, as a criminologist, I think it fails to acknowledge financial and emotional impacts of individual victimization and cybercrime. So I think it's an interesting approach, but limited in its scope if we want to really consider the holistic impact of online harms. However, what cybersecurity researchers do very well is deploy an empirical imagination in terms of data collection and data analysis. And cybersecurity researchers have relied on a very broad range of data sets, very creatively collected, using automated systems very often, relying on forum posts as criminologists have, but also insurance policy prices and wording, stock market activity, Bitcoin transactions, legal cases, data breach incident reports, surveys, and many other data sources, and using automated data processing to really capture millions of data points and trying to understand the whole cybercrime and cybersecurity ecosystem at scale. And I think this is maybe one of the weaknesses of cybercriminologists, the lack of ability to rely on such rich data sets, with maybe an exception made by Cambridge's Cybercrime Center trying to make available some of those very rich data sets to criminologists. So what we have as a result is those, what we call in Canada, those two disciplinary solitudes of criminology and cybercriminology on one side, and cybersecurity on the other side, failing to communicate and to enrich each other's theoretical and empirical toolboxes. This is surprising because, on the other hand, the practitioners have actually been the actors of a convergence in terms of harms and responses. So in terms of cyber harms, for example, we used to think of threat actors and their motivations in terms of this very neat table or graph, a description of nation states being motivated by geopolitical interests and cyber criminals being motivated by profit. And the reality actually is much more murky at the moment. We see that a lot of the state-sponsored groups now also engage in cybercrime for profit activities. This is the cover of a very interesting article published this week in the New Yorker, trying to map the cybercrime activities of North Korea and its state-sponsored hackers. There have been also instances where the leaks of offensive government attack tools have been used by cyber criminals, state-sponsored hackers selling access to the networks they control to cyber criminals, and also buying access to compromised machines for cyber criminals to engage in espionage. So we see there is a convergence of cybersecurity and cybercrime harm threat actors. And by the same token, we see also a convergence of the government agencies and entities responsible for responses to those online harms. So these are three screen captures of three national cybersecurity centers created over the past 5 years in Canada, the UK, and Australia. And what's interesting is that those centers were created from their national signals intelligence agencies, so espionage and intelligence agencies, but their mandate is to respond to the needs of individual users and SMEs, and to engage in partnerships with the private sector. So we see a blurring of the existing boundaries that used to exist between high policing and low policing, between the police and intelligence agencies. And we need to understand and to map and to capture those new interactions at a much more granular level to understand what's happening. So in the paper, Chad and I are trying to map on those those interactions on the crime security continuum, the low policing, high policing continuum. We've tried to add also a local international dimension, and we can, and this is not an accurate representation. This is just a very rough sketch of what's happening, but you see that local police and intelligence agencies are connected through those national cybersecurity centers, through the private sector as well, through critical infrastructures. And what we need to understand, and this is really the gist of our paper, is the research questions we need to ask. So the role of police organizations, for example, in this new configuration of capacities and expertise, and how police agencies should be resourced and should be organized. What should be the boundaries that used to exist between the police, between intelligence, and between defense organizations? Because there is also a blurring of those boundaries that might be a little bit concerning from a democratic perspective, because those organizations operate under very different sets of regulations and constraints. What should be the role of international organizations in this new cybersecurity/cybercrime architecture, and where does the private sector fit in? So we need to, the reason why we want to raise attention to that is we need to pay as much policy attention on the responses to cybercrime as we do to responses to cybersecurity. And that's really the aim of this paper. So I think I'm running out of time. So if you have any question or any comment, I think we have a few minutes left. But if you're interested in this line of thinking, and if you'd like to engage more with us, you can first go to see the paper. It's the latest issue of the Journal of Criminology, which used to be the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Criminology. It's been relaunched. And if you're interested, feel free to drop us an email. We'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are on this issue, which we think is really important. And this is really a call to cybersecurity and cybercrime researchers to design collaboration opportunities and collaboration platforms.